Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Temporal June meetup. We have a fun agenda today. So after a brief welcome, and of course, after mentioning the Temporal Replay conference, we will hear from our friends at Twilio, and we will hear from my colleagues today talking about the Python SDK and the new temporal interface. Okay, the new temporal user interface, much better. All right, I want to direct everybody's attention real quick to our conference replay in real life in Seattle, August 25, 26. If you are interested, check out the lineup, check out the speakers. And if you're interested, check out temporal.io/replay to get tickets and join the party. And with that, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Damir from Twilio, who will talk about temporal at Twilio today. And let me make sure he has permission to share the screen. Yes, I believe that is all good now. And hey, Damir.
Now I can speak. There you go.
All right.
Can you hear me? Nice.
Yes,
do you hear me?
Thank you.
Fine, or is there any weird jitter when I'm speaking?
No, that sounds good. All good
Cool.
on my end.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, Dominic, in semi-person, almost in person. My name is Damir. I'm super happy to have the chance to share some experiences we at Twilio had with Temporal. It's mainly going to be focused around, the common pitfalls of a once hot startup that then became a big tech company, and how you actually migrate to something like Temporal, right? And how you make that actually work. So without further ado, I'll just start sharing my screen. And jump straight right in. Let me just move the heads over so I actually see the people I am speaking with. Cool. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about the do's and don'ts of microservice modernization. So 3 lessons we at Twilio made to move by moving to Temporal. My name is Damir Dizdarević. I'm a product lead at the Edge platform team. Kind of weird. We're not a classic internal platform team. We own all the infrastructure, all the edge infrastructure for every API request or any other sort of request coming into Twilio. We are very focused on resiliency, and that's actually the reason why we started working with Temporal. Just a heads up for the people of you who are not super aware of, there you go. For you who is not super aware of what Twilio does, we are basically what Twilio used to do in the past. We provided very basic APIs, or actually quite powerful APIs, but very simple in its usage for messaging, video, voice, any sort of communication channels that were available, very developer friendly. Today, actually, we at Twilio went one level further. So we own all the communication channels, but now we try to really provide smart tools for customer engagement at scale. So with products like Twilio Flex or Segment, we intend to the communications channels that companies already have with their customers to actually leverage them and do meaningful stuff and not just spam them with SMS messages. So that's what Twilio does. And when we got in touch with Temporal was roughly 2 years ago. Actually the architecture team at Twilio, where where now a Temporal employee sits, was in the initial Twilio team back then, and started working on providing solutions on how we can improve workflow orchestration. Because workflow orchestration at Twilio was a topic since day one, but arguably kind of broken topic. So, and I'll get into contact with that. So we had Temporal roughly for the past 2 years, but the really 6 months, it really started let's say really adopting within the company. So I mainly want to talk about 3 things today, just to give you some highlights on what we did. Some common mistakes when scaling a tech company, when it comes to microservice orchestration that we have encountered, and kind of like some stories about that. An alternative approach with modern workflow orchestration, such as Temporal, what we learned there, and really learning from migrating things from legacy services. Legacy service migrations is a tricky thing, especially in the realm of workflow orchestration. So we want to share some best practices we found that work to get people out of old task schedulers into a technology like Temporal. Cool. So let's start with common mistakes when scaling a tech company. So workflow orchestration for a company like Twilio has been a problem really since day one. And when I mean day one, probably one of the first things that have ever been written was a workflow orchestration problem, generating customer invoice at the end of the month. This is something that today is pretty much standard. Any tool will be able to provide you out of the box. Back then when Twilio was founded, generating invoices for a product as complex as Twilio was pretty hard. So right off the back, the company started actually with scheduling tasks in an asynchronous way, picking them up on a regular cadence on a monthly basis, and generating all these invoices for customer. Marketing funnel, user creation was a big topic initially in the company, but very core stuff to the business like phone call transcriptions that happen asynchronously, very computational heavy things, is also one of the big use cases initially. So from the get-go, Twilio really had a big need of engineering of like workflow orchestration problems in the beginning that needed solutions. Now, we actually interviewed many of the people who have built these services in the past. And one thing we always found out is these type of problems are very interesting engineering problems, right? When you can build like a little invoice, monthly cadence thing, and just, cool, I could, build a little API here and I can connect it like this and I can build a really cool thing, right? And then usually stuff like this happens, right? One engineer will be like, let me build a simple PHP task scheduler for this thing I want to do, right? The problem you will encounter though is that in 8 other departments, people have the exact same thoughts. And that's how you end up with basically the same product. One is implemented as a cron job scheduler, then you have a Go version because somebody likes Go more than Java, and somebody builds a better version of the old thing. And you end up basically with, in the case of Twilio, we ended up with more than 8 different task scheduling or task worker solution across the company, right? And some we only recently found out about it. They have been in production for quite a while, right? But that is obviously not really a desirable situation, primarily if your focus is on resilience. These type of products can very quickly turn into ticking time bombs that nobody really intends to touch. In order to make things even more complicated, back then, when they were built, they were designed as monoliths, right? Some are even running like PHP 5 or old MySQL databases. So you have these really critical products in production that are basically very hard to evolve or maintain. So we really realized we got to get out of this. So the first learning we really had was we got to fight the urge of building opinionated solutions to specific problems and really be aggressive about that. Like, every single line of code that will be written is a line of code that will have to be maintained, documented, and at some point maybe deprecated. So most microservices will stick around longer than the engineers that work for the company. And that was a very hard learning we took because most of these schedulers are not owned anymore. So analogy we use is, very often the term you build it, you own it, or you build it, you run it is used. We actually view that almost as a very dangerous statement because it kind of implies that the things you own, you have built, but very rarely that's the case. In most companies, the things you own are things you haven't built initially, right? So the way we intended to shift our mentality was instead of you build it, you own it, you should build it as if you would never own it. Because that way you actually build services and design services in a way that somebody can inherit them, understand what they have been built for, and you effectively migrate them away, right? So we kind of like flip that internally. We really want people to build services as if they would never have to own them and build the confidence that another person can operate them and actually use them further. I'll quickly stop here. Any questions so far? Any thoughts, doubts? Cool, then I'll just keep going. So number 2, an alternative approach with modern workflow orchestration. So when these teams started implementing workflow orchestration solutions, all the common problems came up. What should I do when my job fails? How should my retry logic work? Unavailability of services, a big problem, right? Observability. Very interesting problem. One thing we learned, many engineers at Twilio had the assumption that when they build a service, they did it to have perfect observability, right? But they only have it. Once somebody else had to own it, that observability was gone effectively. And more complex question, like how do I deal with multiple asynchronous tasks that wait for each other? So this created, again, the same issue, right? Like while these solutions were well intended, and they solved a very specific need, they turn into problems over a while, right? To give you a very good example of, very often the solution remains static when you've built it, but the problem evolved. For instance, the problem of monthly or annual conversational or transactional emails being sent out. 5, 6, 7 years ago, that wasn't a problem you would get out of the box. And most teams back then implemented such transactional email things into their software, right, into their backends. So the solution remained static, but the problem completely evolved. Nowadays, you wouldn't write a line of code for these type of things. Now you would just take it off the box, right? The second thing is you really get slower with time, as mentioned before, and you almost end up in a situation where you have like organizational paralysis. The more of these intertwined services you have that don't have clear ownership, right, where quite hard to track things such as workflow orchestration happen, they continuously decrease the organizational velocity to like a point of full paralysis where people are like, either we migrate the service now away or we don't. So be very careful with it. And you will always find the edge case. No matter how much time a team intends to build something like Temporal, they're not going to quite build the thing that Temporal provided. So it's almost not worth the fight. So we started adopting Temporal roughly 2 years ago. Back then, it was really about Temporal and Cassandra clusters. Luckily, we migrated that all away. But that was like a very ignorant, like, hey, let's just write a wiki page about what Temporal is. And that's how Twilio does Temporal, right? By now, most of the people, if you look at the owners, are people who have left the company by now. So it's like, hey, we got to pick this up and build it in a more sustainable way. Now, one lesson I would like to share is when we argued, hey, let's start using Temporal, we very often got the message, oh, but we end up in vendor lock if we really use something like Temporal for all these things, it's just another thing that's gonna like tie our hands, right? Now, the cool thing though is about it is, and that was our main learning, maybe that's a bit of a statement not everybody would agree with, but I actually would argue it's the complete opposite. Temporal really allows you to focus on raw application logic. If you decide to then move on to anything else you intend to do, you haven't spent a minute writing any complex boilerplate code, to really make all these things work. So if you actually go with a technology like Temporal or any other, elegant workflow technology, you actually reduce the risk of vendor lock, right? Because your team is just writing application logic. You have not invested time that you would have invested in the first place anyway, right? So you are dramatically more flexible compared to any internal homegrown solution, which we found, and which was a very important thing because such things are rightfully discussed on architecture level, right? Like to what extent are we committing to a vendor? And that was a really strong argument on that side. And as a third bit of nugget is basically the learnings we had from migrating teams to Temporal. Number one, with migrations, probably most people on this call will have dealt with this problem many times in their lives, right? For technology migrations, there are no silver bullets. Every migration is different. Every migration will, confront you with different problems. But there's a few things we have really learned along the way. Now, I do want to preface, this is a migration where we couldn't just forcefully call out the deadline and be like, if you don't migrate, we'll just turn off your thing. No, this was a migration where we had to play nice to get team really understand the value of getting out of these legacy systems. The first thing we really understood as a platform team, internal teams are your customers. Internal engineers are your customers, and you have to treat them as such. You need to provide them basically with at least friction as possible to onboard to a service like Temporal and get out of the other. So that was a big shift in our mentality. You're not going to force them to migrate in a way where things go smooth. One thing that was super helpful, we interviewed all these internal teams, and once we started asking them if their problem is still valid, first answer was, we don't know, because it's something that has been written ages ago. But once they went down the rabbit hole of really understanding is the problems these things were solving weren't even valid in the first place. So one big learning in most technology migrations we encountered was a third of the problems being solved there are not relevant anymore. So if you just give teams enough time, they can just throw away their code and not even deal with it in the first place. So there's this famous Peter Drucker quote, like, if you just get rid of the past, the only thing you can do is really move forward. And we found that with such migrations. One thing that is, though, very helpful is to communicate very clear timelines. Migrations take time, and teams have their roadmaps planned for up to 6 months. So really communicate early timelines on when you intend to do such things. Very practical thing on migrations. When at Twilio, we have a few very large task workers, monolithic task workers, where any team in the past was able to commit their worker logic into a monolithic application, which is obviously a nightmare, right? The first step we had to is break out these task workers into individual microservices that teams own them and operate them. That was really critical. And that's, if I were to do such migration again, this is where you have to start. Breaking out the monoliths so that teams really can own their worker logic, and you're not really tied necessarily to other teams there. And one thing which doesn't fully align with what I said before, don't build opinionated solutions. But one thing we did notice is for some of the services we have, some of the task schedulers, we have started providing backward compatible APIs. So some teams, we have some schedulers internal to Twilio where you just send an API request and like, do this and just send me at some point a response. What we did is we have completely, killed off the services in the background and just provided simple proxy services that just send application logic to Temporal and execute it there. So for the teams, it looks like they're still using those old PHP services, while in the background, we completely strip them away and have Temporal running in the background and just proxy them into our Temporal instances, and then to these carved out microservices. I'm happy to go into more detail with this because it's a bit more complex. But yeah, just making it invisible for some teams that already do work for orchestration was very helpful to get out of the old tools and have Temporal being adopted. So one of my engineers, Juan, says it very well, a good way with migrations is to provide as many carrots as possible, but as many sticks as needed. And that was a good way to think about it, right? Like you really give as many carrots as you can, but sometimes you need some sticks to get people really moving and incentivize them to get out of these type of products. So I hope this wasn't too long overall, but yeah, that's roughly kind of like some of the learnings we have. I'm super happy to go into detail or share more things about that, but those are kind of like the big learnings that Twilio we made so far. Yeah, that's it. Dom, do you want to take it over? Charles, I see some hands raised.
Yeah, Damir, this was really excellent. Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious, now that let me lower my hand, hold on. Now that you're on the other side of this transition, when you have a new engineer that joins Twilio, how do they build the intuition for kind of what implementation or feature is a temporal feature versus not? Like, what's the heuristic that you give new folks that join now in terms of when they apply this when they're building new services, let's say?
It's a very good point. We haven't reached the maturity yet where I would argue any engineer at Twilio would just go ahead and write temporal code. But the way we do it right now is I think there are a few use cases, especially for more modern products. One of our products, Twilio Flex, where you do pretty complex routing of actions. A customer care agent picks up a phone call and an email is triggered. So it's actually a workflow experience core. The way we do it is we operate on a product level. So if a product has workflow orchestration in it, they would usually go through the process of writing a little blueprint. We call those blueprint documents where they explain how Temporal could solve their problem for them. It's not ideal yet, but I think for rather large problems, teams would go through such architectural process. We do see the use cases pop up left and right where teams just onboard them. Now, one thing we have learned is that's probably the best situation. We have a few hardcore temporal advocates at Twilio that have been around for 2 or 3 years, right? And we have a workflow orchestration Slack channel. What happens is that the community within Twilio figures it out themselves. These advocates really jump in and people just shout out a question. Hey, I want to build this little thing. I would like to use temporal that way. How should you do it? So far, the internal community solved it itself. But it is something we're actively working on. At Twilio, we have something called internal product docs, which is a markdown-based, internal, how do you call that? Internal product docs, basically what you would have for API documentation, where we write explicit guides on how to onboard to technologies. So that's one thing we're doing here. We have to be very careful though, because Temporal's documentation is excellent. And we try to understand where do we draw the line of redocumenting what Temporal does already. So our documentation is mainly how do you set it up in Okta? How do you get going? And do you need more complex architectural approvals overall? But yeah, those are kind of the direction we're currently going. We don't have a perfect process yet though for it, Charles.
That's great. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Anybody else? Any other questions? That was an absolutely fantastic presentation.
There's another question actually. Deepak asked, what tools do you use for documenting temporal workflows?
We don't really have such a tool right now, if I'm being very honest. Now, oh my God, this sounds a shame, but I would argue Google Docs probably, unfortunately, is still the source of truth for, let's say, rather complex workflow. Why? Because, a lot of the architectural blueprints go through that right now. We do try, though, to have these things documented if it's a really critical workflow in our internal product docs, which uses, don't kill me now, how is this little XML plugin called that generates graphs in GitHub? Mermaid, I believe. So we use a Mermaid as a very simple way to just write out, high-level flows, and these will be automatically deployed to that. I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe you mean something more specific, but I think if it's very critical workflows, we try to usually do those in internal product docs because they're version controlled and they just can't disappear. So that's kind of like how we do it right now.
What about for like the actual interfaces? Do you guys use anything like protobuf or any sort of like annotations on the?
Not yet. I think we haven't reached the maturity where the products are that complex in that regard. But I'd be curious to learn more about it, to be very honest, though. It seems like there's something we can pick up at Twilio.
And maybe you and I can talk offline about that.
Cool.
Dominic, You see there's another question. You want to grab that one?
So we have one question from John. How do you decide to change the various workflow configuration settings for each new workflow? Do you have a standard set of questions to ask to determine this?
No, we don't have a standard set of questions. One thing that usually happens is coming back to the blueprint process, which we have a few architects at Twilio who usually anything that has a complex workflow orchestration assigned to it, such proposal will go through their hands. So there right now, let's say they have a very informed understanding of what has worked in the past or not. We don't have those formal suggestions on how to do these things right now, though. So I fear I have to disappoint you with not being able to really give you a good answer on this. We don't have a standard set, at least right now.
Awesome. Any more questions?
All right. If anybody has any more questions, please do feel free to post them in the chat. And maybe Damir can also answer some of the questions in the chat. Again, that was a fantastic presentation. Watch out for many, many, many copyright violations in the future. I will be responsible for about 99% of them.
Go crazy. They're all yours.
All right. I like it. Cool. Now then, we have the next presentation in our lineup. That will be my colleague, Tom. He will be talking about the Python SDK today. Tom, want to take it away? Oh, hold on, you are on mute. Tom, hold on 1 second.
Sorry about that. I was muted. I wanted to mention just an update on the Python SDK. There was a new release last week that made it possible to do in Python a lot of the things that you can do in the other SDKs. One of the most important is being able to define workflows in Python. In the previous release, you could define activities, but now you can also define workflows. The code for this is still in alpha, and we don't make any guarantee about the compatibility at this stage because we're still making changes. And a good example of one of the changes that we've made is how activities are defined. They're now marked with a decorator, like I've illustrated here. Another change is that you can override the activity type, and that defaults to the function name, but you can use a different value by specifying it in a name attribute on the decorator, which I also show here. And finally, this release had support for the ARM-based macOS platform, which is great news for those of us like me that have one of the newer MacBook Pros with an M1 processor, because you can now install the Python SDK for Temporal really easily. So I want to mention how you do that. Before I cover how to actually use the SDK, I want to show how to install it. I've tested this both on my M1 MacBook Pro with Python 3.10, and I've also done it on a ThinkPad running Linux, and that has Python 3.8. In both cases, I followed 3 steps. The first one has really nothing to do with Temporal, but it's just a typical practice for Python developers, and that's to create a virtual environment. This is going to keep the SDK and other libraries that you use in your project isolated from the other installations of Python that you might have on your system. You just create a directory. In this case, I've chosen the name devspot, create a virtual environment in that directory, change into it, and activate the virtual environment. From then, you can update the pip module, and that's a program that's used to install Python packages. Technically, this also has nothing to do with Temporal, but if you skip this step, then the next step may fail because pip may not pick the correct wheel, which is a pre-built package. And that problem may not be obvious because the error that you'll see if this happens doesn't mention that you have an outdated version of pip. Ask me how I know that. And so the third and final step is really the one to do with Temporal, and that's just simply to use pip to install the Temporal SDK for Python. And that's a package named Temporal IO. As I mentioned, I have one of the Macs with an M1 chip. And if you're like me and you also have one, you might need to use a slightly different command to install the SDK. It'll have a few more options than what you see here. That command is listed in the README for the Python SDK. I'm not going to show it here because it's actually a workaround for kind of a short-lived problem with an upstream dependency. And it shouldn't be necessary for long. In fact, if you do this a day or maybe a week from now, it won't be necessary, and you'll use the same command to install the Temporal SDK regardless of what platform you're running. So now that I've explained how to install the SDK, I want to show you how to define and execute a temporal workflow in Python. As I mentioned, this release has full support for workflow definitions, and that includes features like signals and queries. I'm going to do something really basic though, and show how to create a workflow in Python with a really simple definition. It's probably the simplest possible example that we have. This workflow doesn't have any activities. It doesn't take any input. It just returns a literal string. But this simplicity, I hope, is going to help you see and understand the structure. And then you can use that as a starting point for writing something maybe a little more ambitious. By the way, I mentioned string here, and that's important. This library uses MyPy to support typing and generics. So this code's going to fail if you try to return something here that's not a string, for example, an integer. That's a good thing because it's going to help you identify problems in your code earlier than you would otherwise. So there's 3 steps to writing a temporal workflow definition using the Python SDK. The first step is to import the workflow support from the SDK, which I do here in line 1. In the Python SDK, workflows are always defined as classes. So the next step is going to be to define a class for your workflow and decorate it with a workflow.defin, as you see here on lines 3 and 4. Finally, the last step is to write a method in that class that's going to be invoked during workflow execution, and then use the workflow.run decorator to mark that method as the entry point. And you see this on line 6 and 7. Every workflow must specify exactly one method like this, and it must be defined as asynchronous, just as you see here. In this example, that method is called say hello, and it returns a string. In Temporal, activities are used to carry out well-defined operations, particularly those that involve accessing files, databases, or external services. Since I'm simply returning a string created from an input value, this part of my business logic doesn't really need to be inside an activity, but I wanted to show you how to execute one from within a workflow. This example is similar to the last one, except that I've delegated the business logic for saying hello to an activity. In the Python SDK, an activity is simply a function identified by a decorator. I showed an example of that earlier, and that's exactly the same activity that this workflow is calling. Since that particular function takes a string as input, I modified the workflow to also take a string as input and then pass that into the activity. In Temporal, workers host workflows and activities. In other words, these are the things that run your code. You in turn have to run the worker, and that's easy because it has a main function, so you can do that like you would any other Python program. Barring a failure, a worker is going to keep running until you stop it, so it's going to process many workflows and many activities. And here's a simple example of a worker in Python. Most of it's pretty generic code. In fact, only lines 2, 3, and 9 have anything to do with this particular workflow. Those lines mention the workflow type, which in this case is greet the world. That's the name of the class for the workflow that I wrote. And it also mentions the activity type. Workers have to be aware of the workers and activities that they're expected to process. So we have to register those with a worker. The only other thing that's specific to my workflow is the name of the task queue, which I have creatively named Hello Task Queue. That's the name of the dynamically created queue where it's going to look for tasks to work on. Line 7 might change depending on how the temporal cluster you're using is set up. In this case, I'm using it to connect to a local instance, which I've deployed on my laptop using Docker Compose. But if I was running in production, either on a self-hosted cluster deployed to a different machine or on Temporal Cloud, I'd have a different host name, a namespace, and a few parameters related to authentication there. We can execute a workflow using TCTL, which is the command line utility for interacting with Temporal. But an alternative to this is to create a Temporal client and use it to call the execute workflow function from another program. This is an attractive option for real-world scenarios because it makes it possible to interact with Temporal workflows from your own applications. For example, if you wanted to launch a workflow by clicking a link on a web page or a button in a mobile app, your application code would react to those clicks by doing something like what you see here. In this simple example, I'm just going to run it as a Python program. So I have a main function. On line 6, I create a Temporal client the same way that I did in the worker code. In line 7 and 8, we use that client to execute the workflow, passing in the name of the workflow entry point method, the string that is our input parameter, and an identifier for this workflow, and the name of the task queue, which matches the same thing that we have in the worker. Because I'm calling it with await, it's going to block until the execution is complete, at which point it's going to assign the output to a variable called result, and then execute line 9, which prints it to the screen. Now that I've shown you all the pieces, I want to show you what it looks like to run it. First, you run the worker so that it can do the processing work. Next, usually in a different terminal window, you're going to run the client application, which is going to start the workflow. Again, you could use this, you could do the same thing with TCTL. And finally, then you see the result. And that's how you write and run a temporal workflow with the Python SDK. I want to mention that the Python SDK is still in alpha and there's no guarantee of compatibility, but this means we're still at a point where we can make changes and improvements. So your feedback is really welcome. Like all the other SDKs and the temporal platform itself, the Python SDK is open source and your contributions are welcome. There's really a lot of ways that you can contribute. Obviously, contributing to the SDK itself is one way, but writing some example code is another. Have a look at the code samples in our GitHub repositories for other languages like Go or TypeScript. Maybe you can port one of those to Python. Maybe you could write a blog post that describes an example you've written. That's another way that you can help the community. Just trying out the examples, reading through the documentation, and providing feedback on your experience is really valuable. And that's it for me. Thanks for your time and attention. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. If anybody has any questions, please do post them in the chat. And also let me say, highly encouraged to check out the Python SDK. It's like the temporal SDK really neatly fits into Python via async await. So it's absolutely joyful. So highly encouraged, check it out. And thanks again, Tom. And then we have the last presentation for today. That is going to be about the temporal UI. And then I would like to hand over to Candace and Alex to talk about the latest and greatest in the temporal API. Candace, let me see if I need to unmute yourself, or if you can, or if I have to. I think I have to. I think you should be good to go.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Candace van Oostrum, and I head up the product design team. We're incredibly happy to officially announce that our improved web UI is now generally available to all users and is the default experience. Before we walk you through the improved web UI, I first want to thank everyone who's a part of our early alpha and beta program and all the early adopters who helped shape this user experience by providing us with such incredible and insightful feedback. Okay, so with that, I'm going to drop the links to the repos in the chat so you can check out the new Web UI v2, and I'm going to hand it over to Alex Tideman, who's one of our awesome front-end engineers, and he'll walk you through it. Alex? Damir, you might have to unmute him as well, please.
On it. I think we are ready to go.
All right. Thanks, Candace. All right. So yeah, it's my pleasure to walk through our new UI. It's really been exciting to work on this. And again, I want to reiterate, really appreciate all the feedback that we've received. So first thing I want to call out is now the new UI is a default port at 8080 from our Docker image. So we're just going to go ahead and check that out. So the first thing I want to go over here is the new navigation system. So being able to scale out our new features that are coming out, we moved to a vertical navigation that you can see here. And so it takes up very small real estate. So you get a lot of screen for all the things you want to do with workflows and activities. But as you can see, you can expand this out and get some more information here. So what we have here is showing what is your current namespace, navigating to the workflows in that current namespace. If you can view your archive as well, coming to here, so you can archival workflows as well. So if you want to be able to change your namespace, you can click here, and now you'll see this handy drawer that you'll be able to search here and view different namespaces. So if I go ahead and click this other registered namespace, I'm able to go to that namespace and view all those workflows. We'll talk about some of these other options here in the navigation, but this is basically the folio you'll be using to jump around in between namespaces and workflows, and you can close that and open that to be able to see that different information. And there's also some handy tooltips here if you hover over these different icons. And if you like having it collapse all the time, that's going to be default setting. But if you like it expanded, you can expand it, and then from there on out, it'll always be expanded. So those are sticky settings here. So then going into kind of the main page of Temporal here in the UI is the workflow list. So what we do currently is we default to the 1,000 most recent events. So, if you're just in a pretty small one, you'll see here we just have a handful. But then if you go to a larger namespace, we have the first 1,000 here, and you can paginate in between 250 and 500 here. You'll see these different filter options where you can filter by the workflow ID, the type, different time ranges, and then different statuses if you want to be able to check out specific statuses in all your different workflows. Along with that, we have these different time settings, and these are sticky throughout the rest of the application. So if you set it here, you're going to be able to view that same time setting throughout the rest of the UI. It'll remember that. So you can change it to relative. It's always going to have relative everywhere else. As well, we have this advanced search that allows you to do kind of custom querying. So let's say I want to do, running in the last 10 minutes. We can view those, and then you can come here in the advanced search and be able to tweak these. So let's say let's go to the last 2 years and search that. So now you can go back to the basic search, and you'll see now that I've updated it here to 2 years. So you can toggle in between kind of our basic search options, and as well as open up and allow you to write your own querying with the advanced search. And that is something that Candace will touch on as one of the upcoming features that we're going to be working on, is improving this global kind of search options to be more helpful and powerful. All right, so let's dive into actually the kind of the meat of a specific workflow. So let's go back to this default one. So let's say I come into this failed workflow. What you're going to see here now is some tab navigation to be able to view, what are the workers on this workflow? What are the pending activities, the stack traces, and queries? And this is a failed one, so it's no longer running. So some of these things aren't showing, but I'll show those a little bit later. But you get here the kind of the basic information of this workflow. What is its task queue? What is its state transitions? And then the input and the results of this workflow. So you can really quickly see, okay, what happened? If this failed, I can really find out quickly and jump into the stack trace and say, okay, now I get this message, I know what was wrong. But then the interesting information here down at the bottom is the table of event history. So what we have here is now we have defaulted to descending order from most recent to the least recent, and you can toggle that by just flipping in between these two. We have these 3 tabs here showing the timeline, the compact view, and the JSON view as well. So the compact view allows you to kind of group activities together and kind of highlight things that say, oh, this is the one that timed out or failed. Give you some color cues here to really allow you to draw attention to these certain things. So the compact view is that kind of group of events, and then the timeline view is single events, and then the JSON view is just a giant JSON view of all the different events. So looking through here, you can toggle like expanding all of these at once, so you can go through all of them and see all the details, or you can collapse them all and then individually toggle any of these events to see more information about it. So you can see here that we have one that's timed out, and one of them, the execution has failed. So you can see that's highlighted red, and you can jump to that. As well, some of these have lots of different information. So we've grouped those activities together to be able to jump and view different specific things. So you don't see everything all at once. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to see per different event. As well, you can download the JSON of this event history from up here. And then if it is a running workflow, so let's go back to a different namespace here. Oh, that one just completed. That one as well. But you'll be able to terminate this workflow here as well, as long as it's running. And that's another future enhancement we want to have, is being able to add a whole lot of different actions to this workflow page, which includes, cancel, reset at specific points, all the different things you can do in TCTL from the command line. All right, so just a couple other things here that I want to highlight. Down here, you can see we have a couple other icons, and one of these is the configure the data encoder. So this allows you to set a remote codec endpoint, or you can use the TCTL plugin port as well, where you can set a port number here, and that allows you to do data encoding in between. Temporal just allows you to just see the encoded information, and then this setting these up in the settings here allowed you to decode that information so you can see it here within the workflow page. So there's two different options there for data encoding. And then one kind of nifty feature here that we don't really have navigation to, it's kind of hidden, but if you do /import, what this allows you to do is run the UI by picking a JSON file. So if you had downloaded something in the UI, you can pick that file and choose import, and then you can view that UI with all those different events from a JSON file. And this is really handy if you don't have that specific workflow that you had ran a year ago or a month ago, but you have that JSON file that you've downloaded it. You can just come in here and quickly view the details of that history. So that's all I got. So I'm going to kick it back to Candace.
Dominic, she needs to be unmuted.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you, Alex. I'm so pumped to see everything that's been added in. I want to say, with this GA announcement, this is still worth the beginning of our journey to build out a delightful first-class developer experience. So we want to continue our design partnership and ask for your feedback. And you can do that in the Slack web UI channel. Or if you have any issues, you can go to our repo, UI repo and issues, and you can file things there. But I want to also just share, Alex already sort of mentioned a few of the things, but some of the big features that we have on planned to start working on to continue to evolve the experience is improving the advanced search and making that the default mega search. We want to give it some love, and so that will be involved like some predictive type ahead, as well as bringing in the search attributes in a pop down, so you can see that you don't have to reference the docs, and driving parity with the same behaviors in TCTL. And we also want to bring in all the client actions that you can do in TCTL, so really driving that parity. So Alex showed you terminate, but we want to bring in cancel, reset to any point, signal, query, triggering a timer earlier, complete or fail an activity, and as well as starting a workflow. The way we want to sequence these is we'll start adding these to the detailed workflow page, then we'll bring them to the workflow list page, and then we'll bring in bulk actions. So that is improved search and client actions in the web UI. So that's it. Please give us your feedback. And last and important thing, I want to share that we are also getting ready and planning to deprecate V1 on September 30th. So if you are still on V1, I would strongly encourage you to start adopting V2. Again, that deprecation date is September 30th. Are there any questions or other feedback or topics?
All right. If you have any questions, please do post them in the chat. Thank you very much, Candace. Thank you very much, Alex. That was
There is one question,
presentation.
Dominic. Someone asked, Fushan asked, is SSO supported in V2?
There is, Alex, did you want to answer that, or do we have Ruslan on? Oh, Alex is muted again.
Yes.
Yes, it is supported. SSO is absolutely supported in V2.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you very much. I gotta say, this was an absolutely fantastic meetup. I enjoyed that very much. So before we open up the round for general questions, I just want to say, if you are sad this meetup is over, almost over already, just like me, check out the chat. I'm gonna post a link to our new series, Temporal Explained, on YouTube. Check it out. The first one is about determinism. It's an interview between Tom and me, and somebody said Tom has a great speaking voice. I agree. So if you wanted to listen to him some more before we post this video on YouTube, here you go. And so I will now give everybody the possibility to unmute themselves for like free-flowing questions. And we had one question a little earlier in the chat. Let me see if I can find that again. And it was about temporal and transactions. So let me just read this real quick. Find it. Here, in our organization, we sometimes have failed transactions. So we have to track them with our payment provider. Should we use Temporal for that? So that's absolutely a very popular use case for Temporal to ensure application level consistency. So a Temporal workflow provides you effectively once semantics. So Temporal guarantees that your workflow execution executes effectively once from beginning to the end. So with that, a lot of consistency concerns are addressed already trivially. However, if your workflow actually does get stuck because your upstream service provider, for example, your payment provider, experiences a permanent failure, so your workflow cannot move forward, right? Temporal does not drop the ball. You actually see that the workflow is stuck, where the workflow is stuck, so you can address that situation, right? So under most circumstances, Temporal will actually make sure that your application level consistency is met. However, again, if your upstream services do run into permanent problems, Temporal gives you the possibility to actually react to it. It will not just silently drop the ball somewhere and you don't know about the set of workflow execution or the set of transactions that failed. No, Temporal actually lets you look into that. So yeah, that is my answer to that question. If anybody has anything else, please feel free to post in the chat or unmute yourself and more questions.
Just because someone asked about where our meetups are, like where they're available. We actually do have a playlist on our YouTube where you can find all the historical meetup recordings. As I noted, sometimes there's a bit of delay. So I think the one from last month is now just getting posted like in the next week.
Any other questions? Well, nobody has any other questions. I can just give you back a few more minutes of your day. And thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to all of our speakers. I really enjoyed this a lot. It was a fantastic session. So we'll make sure that we have that on YouTube as well. And then I hopefully see you all around next month. Thank you very much.